Hello and welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers, the podcast for those curious about creating a more fulfilling work life. Every business boils down to two basics, people and money. Here we focus on the human side. Numbers matter, but people matter most, and people drive performance. I'm Susan Nichriadon, your host, a coach, consultant, facilitator and author of Leading Beyond the Numbers. It brings me joy to speak to people and explore together how, although we share many similarities as humans, each of us navigates the world through our own unique lens. This adds intricacy to our interactions and contributes to both the depth and difficulties of interpersonal relationships. Join us for stories, strategies, and insights to help you lead your life beyond the numbers. Hello, and welcome to episode 194 of Life Beyond the Numbers, and this episode is going out on Saturday, January 18th. And if you're at home while you're listening to this episode, I recommend that you make yourself a cup of tea. This episode was actually recorded in a tea house. And that is the reason I'm speaking at the beginning of the episode, because the sound quality is variable. It isn't the same as if I was here in my office and my guest was also in front of a microphone. We did share a microphone, but there is a variability in the sound. You may need to adjust the volume a little bit, and I apologise in advance if that interrupts the listening experience. It is a wonderful episode, and I took so much joy from listening back to it. And that's all thank you to my wonderful guest, James Thirlwall. And now, I'll leave you to the episode. Hello and welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers. Well, today I am delighted to be joined by James Thirlwall. James, you're most welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers.
Thank you very much.
Now, I am out and about today, something I've never done on this podcast before, and I'm sitting in a tiny tea house. I'm not going to say any more about that for now, because we will explore why I'm here later. But actually, let's just start with maybe talking a little bit about the tiny tea house. It's probably the best way to start.
Yes, so we're in my tiny tea house in East Oxford, and the tea house is on the Magdalen Road, which is, for people that don't know Oxford, it's kind of a busy, bustling, funky part of town. I think the Daily Telegraph had it as the 13th coolest neighbourhood in the UK, which is a great accolade. And we are nestled within a yoga studio. It's called the Everybody Yoga Studio. So everybody's welcome at the yoga studio and everybody's welcome at the tea house.
Very cool. And the 13th, I mean, yes, a lot of people would say that was an unlucky number, but I don't agree because I was born on the 13th.
Oh, there
so,
you go.
yeah.
I feel good about that.
But tea, why tea? Now, I do not like tea. In fact, I was just telling James when I arrived in that even the smell of tea can make me feel a bit ill. But I am drinking a lovely lemon verbena tea here. But where did this come from, James, your love of tea?
It's a long story, which I'll try and make shortish. So I used to live in Japan. I spent some time in Japan after I graduated from university. And then I went to live in Japan, and then when I came back from Japan, I became interested in Buddhism because I'd spent a lot of time at a Buddhist temple with a Buddhist priestess who was kind of a badass actually. She had, as a Japanese woman, she had divorced and decided that she wanted to go into the priesthood, and so we used to spend a lot of time together. And anyway, so I returned to the UK, became interested in Buddhism, then trained in acupuncture, became a Chinese medicine practitioner for a while, for a decade actually in fact. And along that journey I became really interested. I went to my first tea ceremony, a Chinese tea ceremony, and it was run by a friend of mine, and I was completely transfixed by the idea of these very tiny teapots and these tiny teacups that were serving small amounts of tea, and you had this chance to really connect with the experience of sharing tea with other people. You had the opportunity to really appreciate the tea because it was in these small little cups, and everything about it I fell in love with. I should say that I am, for listeners, I'm 6'5", so I kind of joke that I'm a big man in a tiny tea house because there's space in the tea house for 3 people at most, really, including myself. And so, yeah, I took that idea of Chinese tea ceremony, and we do tea ceremonies here, tea tastings, kind of using that format. So instead of having a big mug of tea, which I'm not averse to, we have small pots of tea with small teacups, and instead of one big pot of tea and you have one mug each, we drink lots of little rounds of tea. So it's a very sociable thing, it's a nice way to connect with people. And so that was what I fell in love with, and so that's kind of how the idea for the tea house came about.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot in there.
Yes, sorry.
No, there is. And you talked about living in Japan and then studying Chinese medicine. Where was the connection between China and Japan?
Yeah, good question. That was more logistical. I became interested in, I think first I became interested in Buddhism, and then through that I started looking around when I was coming back to the UK. So I come from a medical family. My dad's a doctor, my mum's a nurse, and I'd spent a lot of time working in hospitals. Through my university, I paid my university, kind of topped up through university with working in hospitals. I'd worked at Stoke Mandeville Hospital in the spinal unit years ago, and so I had this interest, and I was thinking about coming back to the UK to train as a doctor. And I think I probably underestimated how difficult that would be, and also I think the reasons why I was choosing to do that were not necessarily always my own. And I had been exposed to something new, so I came back, studied Buddhism, not formally but informally with different groups in London, and then I discovered acupuncture. I went for acupuncture one day. It was in North London somewhere, and I lay down on the couch and somebody put a needle in the middle of my forehead, and I had this kind of bizarre experience, where almost like an out-of-body experience, where I was so relaxed. I probably wasn't sure or wasn't aware of how stressed I was at that point, and then suddenly this amazing feeling came over me, and I remember walking out of there, walking down the road. It was in Finchley, that was it, and I stood at the tube stop and I watched about 5 trains go past because I didn't want to get on one. I thought, there's no way I can be around people right now. It was like being stoned, and I thought, great, because I'd been stoned before, and this felt like an expensive way to get stoned, I must say, but it was
healthier though.
It was healthier, yeah. So I guess in the same way as the tea, it just hooked me, and so that was my first introduction to Chinese medicine. So I looked into it, and I looked at studying in Japan, and obviously there's Japanese acupuncture and Japanese medicine, but the availability to be able to study that, or the access to that, is you need to have fluent Japanese, you need to live in Japan. There weren't any schools teaching outside of Japan that I could access, really. Whereas in the UK, it was much easier. So there was a number of schools. There was one in London, there was one in Leamington, there was one in Bristol, and then I chose one in Reading, which was closer to home and just felt like the right fit, really. And so then I became an acupuncturist, took 3 years, and then had a clinic in Oxford. I worked in London a little bit, worked in the Cotswolds, but mostly acupuncture. And then I did that for about 10 or 12 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
And a Chinese tea ceremony is something I've never heard of before I met you. And James and I, funnily enough, met in a coffee shop randomly one day. And here we are now in a tea house. But I'd never heard about a Chinese tea ceremony. I'd certainly been aware of a Japanese tea ceremony. And so I'm also curious about the difference between both of those, because people might not know what either is even.
Yeah. So maybe the Japanese tea ceremony is a good place to start, because I think more people are aware of that or have some kind of notion of it. So, and again, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in this, but I have had enough exposure to talk about it. The style of tea in the Japanese tea ceremony, there are various ones, but I think the one that's the most known to people is where you have matcha, which is a green tea which is ground into a powder, and there is a formal ceremony around boiling the water, preparing the tea, whisking the tea. So you have a bamboo whisk, which looks, I would say, it's like the sort of size and shape of a shaving brush, but it's made out of these bamboo fronds. It's actually one piece of bamboo that's split into many, many different bristles. And then that is then used to whip the tea, and it is served in a very prescribed, formal way. And so the tea is served to guests, and guests are often in a tea house. So traditionally you'd be on your knees in a tea house, and you would be served with traditional Japanese sweets. And so it's very formal, and I think within the form, as with all things, it's a bit like anything that you learn which has a kind of a classical form to it. You learn the classical form first, and then your kind of creative expression emerges from that. And so I'm not a practitioner of that style, but I have seen it, and I know lots of people that really enjoy the tea ceremony for that aspect, the continued practice of a ritual over and over again. And so it's a beautiful thing to observe. The principle of it is hospitality and care for your guests, and that includes things like the way that the different guests in the tea room are spoken to, the way that they're seated, the order in which they're served. There will be a scroll of calligraphy or a painting that's relevant to the season that will be hanging in the tea house. There'll be a flower arrangement that's relevant to the tea or that links to the season. So all of these things are thought about. The kimono or the clothing of the person that's serving will also be relevant, and the tea and the sweets and the teaware and everything about this will be thought of to such a degree that it's seen as the kind of ultimate expression of hospitality, I think. And so that's the Japanese tea ceremony. It has its roots in Zen Buddhism, and so there are many schools in Japan. I hope I can say this without being offensive to anybody, but I would say that the Japanese tea ceremony is about 99% ceremony and about 1% tea. So it's all about the tea in some ways, but it's also about the utensils and the order and the way that things are presented, and it's such a performance that you're able to appreciate it as a thing in and of itself. It's a thing of beauty.
It's like a piece of art.
It's a piece of art, exactly. And it's seen across the world. It's been changed and become more kind of contemporary and evolved in different ways. And there are kind of movements, actually, particularly if you look online now, for people taking that tradition and completely, not subverting it, but changing it into a way which is more modern and accessible, but which would, I'm sure, anger the purists, but also with all of these things, it has the possibility of becoming a dying art or just eating itself with its own dogma. And so people are trying to change that. I'm not one of those people, but I'm aware of that. So that's the Japanese tea ceremony. And then the Chinese tea ceremony, I like to say, is probably 99% tea and 1% ceremony. There are ceremonial aspects to it. And again, there are different forms, but like a lot of Chinese cultural arts, so things like calligraphy or Tai Chi or tea is one, there is this kind of notion of flow. And so this constant sense of flow, and so that flow is the flowing of the tea, it's the flowing of the water, and it's messy. You pour water on top of teapots, things splash around. If you go to tea houses in China, you'll find huge long tea stages, these kind of tea trays almost, where you expect to make mess, but when you actually tune into it, it's not messy, it's deliberate mess, and you can see that the movements of the person that's serving the tea are very deliberate and refined and well practiced, but there's a sense of flow to them which is really fluid, and it just gives this sort of sense of natural presence, I suppose. And the same thing will be there, so there'll be snacks, tea, little bits of food that are connect with the tea and connect with the season. Same with flower arrangements and the ornaments within the space. But the other thing is that there might be many different teas that you would drink, so it wouldn't be one style of tea. It would be, you might start with one particular tea, like a wine tasting, if you think about it like that. With a wine tasting, you might start with a light white wine, and then you might get onto heavier reds, and then you might end up, I don't know, you might end up falling asleep.
Yes,
or
drunk.
Drunk. But there's that kind of progression, and so there is that possibility for you drink that tea, you enjoy that together, and you might just stop, or it might be that you end up talking to each other and sharing conversation and so on. And so in a way it feels much more fluid, much more relaxed, and to me I think that was what I enjoyed about it. And you can take it to different levels. It can be very sociable, it can be very reflective, and I think because I've practiced that, again, not through formal training, but just kind of picked up on that. The thing that I love about it is that it is an act of hospitality, but it's also an act of connection. And so if you have a group of friends that are drinking tea together, it might be at some point that the person serving tea switches out and somebody else wants to sit there and serve, so everybody gets a chance to make tea for other people. So there's this lovely fluidity to it, and the core idea is around connection.
Yeah, which, I'm sitting here watching James explain all of this, and there's such a flow and fluidity to how you explain it, and it makes me want to drink tea.
One day,
which is really interesting. What I loved in your description as you talked about flow and fluidity is also, I kept thinking flow of conversation, and then you end by saying it's about connection. And so is there something in that relaxed Chinese way, less formal, that also perhaps prompts or enables that flow of connection and conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's built for that. The Tiny Tea House has what do you call it, a tagline, or and that is connect with tea. And that can be different things. It can be connect with the experience of drinking tea, and there can be a gastronomic element to it, a sensory element to it. There's connecting with yourself. So when you slow down to pay attention to things in the moment, then it's often surprising what actually comes up, what emerges. And then the other thing is connecting with other people. So in the tea house, there's space to connect with another person. So you generally ask somebody to invite a friend or partner or another tea lover here. And 3 is a really nice number to create that intimate connection. And then the other thing is, so with groups, so by serving tea to other people, it acts as it's an act of hospitality. And so I think that always lays the ground for better connection. And I think when you're doing something where you're not distracted and where you can give your full attention to something and you feel like time is slowed down, then you have the opportunity to really connect with people and talk more open-heartedly, more authentically, all of those things. And those things feel in this day and age quite easy things to say, because it feels like those are the things that people want to hear. But I've had years and years and years of experience of this practice, and if I don't do this practice, and not to say I'm addicted to it, I notice that this practice, like any other practices that we do in our life, if we have a ritual, meditation or going for a run or walking, whatever, all of those things, once you start to take those out, or you start to miss them because you realise they're a big foundation for your sense of happiness, your sense of self, and your sense of connection with things. And so this for me has just been one of those ones that I just, that really makes sense to me. And so that's why I started the Tea House, was to share that with other people, because that's what it's given to me, and that's not about me, that's about setting things up, creating the environment where people can feel relaxed. And coffee, I was joking about coffee at the beginning because I love coffee shops, and coffee shops are places where generally they're very buzzy, you have great conversations in coffee shops, and I always spend way too much money because the cakes are so nice. But you also have grinders grinding and steaming and conversations on phones and laptops and things like that. It creates a different kind of buzz. It's a literal buzz. Like I walk into a coffee shop and I was like, oh, I feel energized, but not in a sense of, I don't feel resourced by going into a coffee shop. I feel like I've had like a caffeine for my mind and my body, and like a social snack almost, just to keep me going. But if I want to have a quieter conversation, then I generally turn to tea, and I'm lucky enough to have this space where I can invite people here to do that. My experience of tea houses in China is that, and I also don't want to make a kind of a facsimile of a Chinese tea house. That isn't the idea. I'm not Chinese, but it's the values of that. And the values are bringing people together in a kind of quiet, relaxed atmosphere. And the idea to try and create an option for people, I think, is what I'm trying to do as well. So yeah, if you want to drink coffee, that's great. Sometimes you might not feel like being surrounded by all those people with all that noise. It's nice to have another option. And in China, in Japan, in Taiwan, in Korea, you do have that option. You can go to those places, and that's the function that they have in society and culture, I think, over there.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when I think of China, I've never been to China. I've been to quite a few Asian countries, but when I think of China, I never think of slowing down and quiet. Because wherever you go in the world, there's a Chinatown. It's always hustle and bustle and so on. Yeah. And this is the absolute opposite of that. But then again, the Asian culture for me, I often think about slowing down. Yeah. Because Asian culture is like saying Western European culture. I mean, it's a catch-all, isn't it? We're all very different. But the idea of Asia always, for me, is much more spiritual, much more connection with myself and with people who seem to have time to talk to you and actually appreciate you as well. Yeah. So James, the workplace mainly is my focus, and slowing down is something that you described it beautifully, I think, how things come up when we take time to slow down and be quiet. And it's one of those... It's almost like until you experience it, you don't really believe it. Yeah. Because you believe that you need to just keep going and do more and do more. Yeah. But when you know, you know. So I know that you bring tea to the workplace as well. So maybe you could talk a little to that.
Yeah, so I was looking recently at some of the needs, modern needs in the workplace. I think after the pandemic, the big one that comes up time and time again is connection. So how people connect physically, because you have these situations where people are working from home or they're hybrid and people aren't necessarily crossing over in the same way as they used to. And I think for a lot of people really like that. There's a lot of benefit to that, and then you lose something at the same time. I'm 48, and so I haven't spent a lot of time in office culture and office environments, but I do read and see people and overhear conversations about kind of different generations and how people think about work and how people relate to work and how people relate to colleagues and those sorts of things. And so I think anything that facilitates people spending time together where they're not talking about work, and also where some of the hierarchies and the power dynamics have been levelled, I think it's quite helpful for people to see the humanity and the person behind the role or the relationship or whatever. So with the tiny tea house kind of on the road or pop-up, whatever you want to call it, one of the values of the tea house in Japan, the way that the tea house is designed is that there's a small doorway which everybody has to enter through. So you can't leave, historically you had to leave all your weapons outside and you had to crawl in on your hands and knees, and so it brings everybody to the same level. That value is what I bring to those kind of offers, so workshops, retreats, offsites, things like that, where we take the tea house, so take all the, we can have a tea ceremony or do a tea tasting, or we can teach people how to make tea for each other. But the basic principle is that we're all in this learning together. It's a new skill, and that when your boss or your colleague is serving you tea, thinking about the experience from your perspective and connecting with you, it feels very different than just kind of making a cup of tea. We do it naturally anyway. People make you a cup of tea. I guess in some ways that's what's gone when people aren't in the office. People don't just pass your desk and say, "Oh, do you want a brew?" So this, in a way, makes it a bit more formal, or kind of creates a reason to do it. But it also, because it's a new skill and it's a familiar skill, but it's a new way of looking at it, a new perspective on it for most people. And because it's built in the idea of making tea in this way helps people to connect. Just through the act of doing it actually helps people to connect. And that doesn't seem like a crazy notion. It's like if you go out for lunch, business deals happen. If you go and play golf, whatever it might be, go and grab a coffee together, it's going to happen rather than on Zoom. And 10 Zoom calls to one, I'm sure there's some ratio somewhere, right? An in-person meeting versus how many Zoom calls or emails. You just get so much more done because all of those things that you can't pick up on email, you can't pick up on Zoom, body language, the connection that you have with people, the way, can you trust that person, or to what level or degree can you trust them? All of those things, your instincts that happen when you're in proximity to somebody are back in the room, so you can make use of that information to make your decisions. So that is one of the things that I take. So in kind of practical terms, what happens is we'll go to a company, or I'll go to a company, and we'll work with a group of somewhere from like 10 to 20 people. So for a smaller group like 10, we can do things like tea meditation. So you learn how to meditate using tea as a kind of a doorway for that, which I think is really helpful for people that don't have a formal meditation practice or find sitting on a cushion or other approaches hard. It's a really nice entry into doing that. The other thing sometimes we do is tea and journaling. So you teach a tea meditation and then we do some journaling around a particular prompt, and then that often is more of a reflective session, generally not something to be shared. That's something just for people just to keep to themselves. But again, in being in the presence of other people doing that and being in that kind of space is actually very helpful for people just to share that time together. I think about it, hopefully if you're in a good family situation, and not everybody's is, but you feel that sense of when you're in a family, you can just kind of relax and be yourself, and you just don't necessarily, people aren't going to ask too much of you. And I think that often at work is that people are always asking things of you. And so to create a space where you can sit side by side, do things quietly, and just be in that space but not have anything demanded of you, not ask you to input. There's always this thing, are you going to contribute, or you can do this, to be allowed the space. Well, you don't have to contribute. You're not going to ask anybody to say anything. If you want to just drink tea quietly, you can do that. So I try to facilitate those kind of environments, and at the same time we also have more sociable ones. So I did one recently where it was the culture to go to a restaurant or go to the pub, and they wanted to do something where alcohol wasn't involved, and which is pretty, can go many directions at work and in life. And funnily enough, when we went through the requirement and the brief, I said, well, I'll come along, we'll do this. So I'll teach everybody how to make tea. We'll make 3 different teas, and we're going to do it with Chinese teaware, which will be kind of fun and get it all messy and so on. And then at the end, I think I might bring like a tea cocktail or something like that. We'll just make something fun. And the person said, well, we don't need a tea cocktail. The whole point is that we're doing this because it's an alcohol-free event. We want to encourage people, include people, so you don't need to bring that. There's no need for that. And that was really an eye-opener because I didn't need any extra fizz on top. The thing that we were there to do did the work, and it was very successful. Everybody loved it. And then they said, oh, can you come back and do meditation and journaling with us next time? So that started the conversation, and they felt some value in that and said, okay, can we do this in a different way? And it didn't need alcohol. And in a way, that was proof of the pudding, I suppose, because there does seem to be a need for these kind of ways of getting together, which don't include alcohol, can be as inclusive as possible, can happen in the daytime, so that you can then go back to work and be productive, And I actually had a conversation with somebody recently in the charity sector who was asking about whether I could come in and do something, and I told her what it costs, and she said, well, that's quite reasonable. And I was surprised because I hadn't fully appreciated, I sort of thought of the charity sector as not having any money essentially, and or having to be more conscious of those budgets. And she said, well, if you think about it, you're going to take our people for 2 hours, give them an experience where they connect with each other so that their work relationships are more harmonious and they can go home feeling good, and then the next day they're all going to turn up to work because they haven't been to the pub. And we would spend roughly the same amount of money on this as we would taking them out for dinner or going bowling or whatever it might be. And so there's a place for all of it, but I think increasingly there is sense, particularly with the younger generation, of thinking, well, I don't want to socialise outside my work hours necessarily. I have my friends and all my other things that I want to do, and why can't we make it happen inside the workday? Why can't we prioritise that as part of our culture? I think that's a big difference, where in the past it was an add-on, and now people are making it an integral part of how they work together.
Which is fantastic, really, I think. And last week I was in London, I was doing a talk in an architecture firm.
Yeah.
And they had this big, beautiful room with a kitchen in it, and every day they serve lunch to all of their staff.
Yeah.
And they do 2 sittings because it was getting chaotic. They said people were queuing on the stairs. But there's something lovely about that as well, is that they care for their staff, so people don't pay for the lunch. Everybody can eat. There's no eating at your desk, which I was a terror for doing. And there's just that time out of the schedule, isn't there? And I think the tea ceremony then is something so, it's different because people don't know what to expect, but you also kind of go, it's just tea. I mean, what can it can't be dangerous because a lot of ideas and workshops that come into organisations perhaps can be a little intimidating, but something like tea is something that, even if we don't like it, we're aware of it from a very, very young age in any culture in the world.
Yeah, and I think it also comes back to, when you said about different cultures, we are, particularly in London, but I mean, most major cities have got people from all over the world and people with all kinds of different cultures and stories, and tea is one of those ones that is the most drunk, apart from water, the most drunk beverage in the world, and everybody has their own ritual, whether that ritual is the way that you make your cup of builders, or whether it's masala chai from your particular area of India, or whether it's your experience growing up around a tea house in Taiwan or something like that. And there are so many, like Turkey's got fantastic, lots of African countries have got incredible tea ceremonies and tea cultures, and so people bring that, and I welcome that into the conversation because I'm an English guy that went to Japan via China, came back and brought some of these ideas, but I'm not the first person that thought of this. I think I'm the first person to think about doing it in this way, in this format, and everybody brings something unique to that, but the whole idea is, what does this trigger in you to think about in your life that you can connect to? And I think that really is like sowing a seed. I don't come and say, right, this is the way you're supposed to meditate, this is the way that you're supposed to drink tea. If you drink this particular tea, then it will give you this particular effect. That's just nonsense. So people have to find their own way, but to give people the opportunity to either rekindle that in themselves or discover something new, I think is the idea behind it. It's a really gentle way of doing it, and because it's familiar to most people, there will be some kind of link. It's not completely alien, and I think that also encourages conversations between different colleagues about their different cultures and memories from home, or memories, whether that be in a different country or just a different time. All of those things are quite nostalgic for people quite often, and so I've been in the room so many times. This is quite a funny, I think it's a funny aside. So when you do tasting, there is sometimes this sense that I think there's this perception about when you do tasting of things that you're supposed to know something about it, right? So it's like, oh, what's the right answer? Is this wine X, Y,
dark
Z?
or
Exactly.
fruity or whatever?
And it's part of our obsession. I love these things. If you can look at my Netflix algorithm, you will see that I will watch Chef's Table and kind of sommelier things. I just love these people that are absolute masters of their craft.
And the senses.
But at the same time, there's this sense that, this is for those people over there. You have to have gone through all this stuff, to all these particular trainings to do that. And that's not really what it's about. And with tea, I never tell people, what are you tasting? What I do, I invite people to tell me what they're tasting. But it can be a flavour, it can be a memory, it can be a sense, it can be a sensation. All of these things are valid because these are the things that happen. So there's no right answer. And I've had some amazing answers. One person said, drank this tea, which was, I would say it's kind of like a bit leathery and a bit kind of like tobacco tasting, let's say. I wasn't saying this, but this is the kind of general feedback. And he tasted it and he said, this tastes like a Chipping Norton charity shop. And if you know what that is, You're like, yeah, that's exactly what it tastes like. And that's perfect. That's a great description. No one else was going to come up with that description. Yeah. And then somebody else said something about, this smells like, or tastes like the bottom of my pet iguana's cage. And you think, well, yeah, it does, because I don't know what that tastes like, but this is a kind of slightly kind of musky, animally. It's got a particular scent to it, which is kind of a bit funky. And so you say, oh yeah, I can get that. That happens quite a lot. And then the other thing is that people often, so I've done a lot of training in different European countries, and quite often people will say, oh, this tastes like the fish that my grandmother used to make, or the smell when you open this particular dish or whatever. And when you go to a country and everybody's got that, or a few people start nodding around the table, you think, oh yeah, this is a thing. Like I would never pick that up myself, because I don't live in this country, I've never had that experience. But for you, there's this kind of common theme. And so I think that's the lovely thing about senses generally, but to invite that also connects people.
Beautiful, the senses, that's amazing. And I think we use our senses obviously to make sense of the world, and then they sift through past experiences trying to think, well, what is this most like? Yeah. And that's it can be a Chipping Norton charity shop or a fish dish. And that's quite incredible, isn't it? Because the memories or experiences that we store, our brain and body will bring them back up, and then the nostalgia. And what was incredible sitting here for me is I'm taken right back to when I was about, I'd say very young, like under 10. And there was this man who used to walk the roads. So this is back in the 70s, early 80s in Ireland. He was of a dying breed. And I guess he was a beggar man, or whatever the title was in those days. And he used to come to my grandmother's house, and he would knock on the door and he would say, any chance of a sup of tea? And my grandmother had his own cup in the house, and he might come every couple of months or every year or something, and he would come to the house, have his cup of tea and be on his way. I guess she gave him some money or some food as well. And then he just stopped coming, so I guess he passed away. But that's what this sitting quiet in here brought up for me, something I haven't thought about in years. So it's amazing how our senses sift through life. And
absolutely, and it bubbles up to the surface. Because when you sit quietly, these things, it just fires off all of these connections, and then suddenly this pops into your mind that you haven't thought of for years. I think that's the beauty of it. And sometimes people can experience that on their own, but if you get to share that with other people and talk about it, then it tells you a little bit about who you are and where you come from, and that's a lovely stuff. It's so evocative of Ireland, isn't it? It's like yes, the man that walks the road.
Yes, and he was dressed in grey, and But this week I've been, so it's the middle of October when I'm recording this, but I've been attending online the Inner Development Goals Conference that's been on in Stockholm in Sweden. And a lot of it has been about connection. So it's about inner development for outer growth. Yeah. And it's quite fascinating. And a lot of what we've talked about today has come to the fore, I think, as well, about how we connect with each other and find joy in things, which brings us to intimacy, which... And intimacy is a great way to work and collaborate with others. It's not intimacy that we think of in books and magazines and movies or whatever. Yeah. It's a very different thing. And it's something, I guess, in our organisations that we still are not making time for. Yeah. And I think what's incredible is when we slow down, we actually can get to the answer often much quicker.
Yeah. I think with these things... Yeah, certainly with there was something that just triggered that in my mind. 1 second. It's gone.
Oh, well. As we'd say in Ireland, it must have been a lie. I'm only joking.
I like that. I'll come back to that. What was it? Oh yeah, that was what I was going to say. I find it so odd in a way that my work life has always been I kind of designed it in the way that I've wanted it to be, and it's never always turned out that well. There's been some ups and downs, but I feel like I'm lucky to being able to chosen the things that I was interested in, and I followed the path of the things that I was interested in. And recently, so my career went from working as an acupuncturist for 12 years, and then we didn't cover this, but I worked for the last 5-6 years in hospitality, and I've worked with Michelin star chefs and 5-star hotels and some of the best hotels in Europe, not globally. What I've noticed is there's this kind of division between, like, there's your work persona and then there's your out of work persona, and so you have to think, well, how much can I bring to work of myself? And there's always a line, there's some compromise there, but wouldn't it be nice if we could bring a lot more of ourselves to work and be allowed to be more ourselves and be forgiving of other people? Because it's like friendships. That's the great thing about friendships, is that your good friends allow you to be who you are. You kind of walk the road together, and that's the mark of a good friendship. There's, yes, people want stuff from you, you help each other out, but there's no demand that you might somehow be a different kind of person around that person. And I think we have to shapeshift a lot when it comes to work, and we all do it. And so in some ways it's not surprising that office parties can be awkward, or outings, and when we go there, because you've suddenly turned up with a bunch of people you've never met before. You thought, who are these strangers that I've been working with? And actually they're showing a different side to themselves. So the closer, I guess, that you can get to bringing some of those things together and narrowing down that gap, you're more likely to have an authentic relationship with those people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what my book is about.
Yeah.
You asked me, I remember when we met, James asked me what my book was about. I don't even think I was able to give you an answer, funnily enough. Yeah. But it's about reconciling both parts of ourselves and allowing us to be ourselves. But often I don't think we know who that is, James, because we haven't slowed down to take time and take stock and actually look at how amazing each of us is as well. Yeah. And we spend a lot of our time comparing ourselves to, I wish I was like that person, or I could do that, or I could do that. And actually, we just need to look at how amazing it is we are even here still. Yeah. And all that goes with that. James, we are out of time, believe it or not.
No way.
So what I'd like to do is, how do people find out more about you and the Tiny Tea House?
Well, we have a website called tinyteahouse.co.uk, and then on Instagram, tiny.teahouse is the Instagram account. And just so if people want to find out, that's the best way to connect and find out what's going on. And it's me at the end of it, so you can, if you want to speak to me, just ask for me.
Yes.
And that would be the best way to.
Fantastic. And I'll put that in the show notes. James, thank you so much for this experience, for the tea, for the conversation and the invitation, first of all, to come here and record as well. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for joining me today on Life Beyond the Numbers. If something in this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to leave a review. It helps others like us discover this podcast and join in our conversation. Until next time, keep exploring the human side of work life.